He took the suppressant at 6:47 every morning. Not at 7, not when he remembered. At 6:47, because that was when Rio left for school, and the 7 minutes between Rio's departure and his own were the only 7 minutes in the day that belonged to no one. He used them to swallow the pill, stand at the kitchen window, and let his scent do what it wanted for exactly as long as he could afford. Then he put the lid back on, straightened his collar, picked up his bag, and became Seo Jihan again, the man no one looked at twice. That was the point. He had spent 4 years building a life that did not invite attention. The apartment was modest. The job was administrative. Mid-level coordinator at Hanil Group's operations division, the kind of role that put him in rooms with important people without ever making him one of them. He filed things. He scheduled things. He made sure the correct documents reached the correct desks at the correct time. He was precise, quiet, and unremarkable. And he had worked very hard to be all three. Rio was 6, dark-haired, serious-eyed, with a habit of asking questions that landed harder than any adult's. Last Tuesday, he had looked up from his rice and said, "Appa, why don't I have a father?" Not upset, just logical. The way he approached everything, with the calm of someone who expected a real answer. Jihan had told him. Some families are built differently, that their family was built exactly right. Rio had considered this for a moment, then nodded and gone back to eating. That was his son. That was the whole of his world. He had not expected the world to change on a Wednesday. The meeting was a formality. A new executive had joined Hanul Group's upper leadership, a restructuring at the director level, which meant updated protocol documents, revised access credentials, and an orientation session that Jihan's department had been assigned to coordinate. He had done this 11 times in 4 years. He prepared the folder, confirmed the room, arrived 8 minutes early, and arranged the materials in the order they would be needed. He did not look at the name on the folder until he was already seated. Kim Do-yeon. The name sat in his chest like something swallowed wrong. He looked at it again, as if looking twice would change it. As if 4 years and a different city and a carefully constructed ordinary life could make that name belong to someone else. The door opened. The scent reached him before the man did. That was always how it worked with an alpha of that caliber. The room shifted slightly, pressure changing, something in the air pulling taut. Jihan had spent 4 years training himself not to react to alpha scent. He was very good at it. He dropped his eyes to the folder, breathed through his mouth, and wrote something on the paper in front of him that meant nothing. Kim Do-yeon walked in like he always had. Like the space around him had already agreed to accommodate him. Tall, composed, shoulders that carried authority without performing it. He was 34 now, 2 years older than when Jihan had last seen him. The difference was subtle, more settled, harder to read. He scanned the room the way alphas did, instinctive, fast, cataloging. His eyes moved across the table. They passed over Jihan without stopping. Something in Jihan's chest released, or broke. He wasn't sure which. The orientation began. Jihan spoke when it was his turn to speak. He used his professional voice, measured, efficient, slightly flat. He had practiced this voice for years. He explained the document protocols. He answered questions about access credentials. He did not look directly at Do-hyun for more than 2 seconds at a time, which was how long it took for eye contact to become something Do-hyun might remember. Do-hyun did not remember him. Of course he didn't. Jihan had changed his hair, his glasses, his posture, his name. Not legally. He had always been Seo Jihan. But in every room he entered now, he was the quiet one, the forgettable one, the one whose scent suppressants were strong enough that even an alpha who had once known exactly what he smelled like would walk past him and feel nothing. He had planned for this. He had planned for exactly this. It still cost him something he didn't have a name for. The second time was 3 days later, in the hallway outside the executive floor. Jihan was delivering a document set. Do-hyun was coming from the opposite direction, phone in hand, unhurried. Jihan had approximately 4 seconds. He turned slightly, shifted the folder in front of him, and became the wall, Do-hyun passed. Close enough that the edge of his scent, warm like cedar and something darker underneath, brushed the edge of Jihan's awareness. Jihan walked to the elevator, pressed the button, looked straight ahead. He had chosen this. He needed to keep choosing it. 4 years ago, the relationship had ended the way things end when they were never given the right conditions to survive. Not with cruelty. Do-hyun had not been cruel. That would have been easier. It had ended with Do-hyun's family and their weight and the quiet, clear statement that his future had been decided before Jihan was ever part of it. An Omega with no family name, no designation credentials, no social standing. Jihan had known what he was walking into. He had let himself believe it wouldn't matter. It mattered. He had left before Do-hyun could find a gentle way to let him go. He had already known by then that something had changed in his body. He had taken the test alone, in a pharmacy bathroom in a city that wasn't his, stared at the result for 3 minutes, and made every decision he would live by from that moment forward. Do-hyun would not know. Do-hyun would not be given the chance to do the right thing for the wrong reasons, out of obligation, out of an alpha's instinct toward ownership, out of the guilt of a man who had chosen family legacy over love. Jihan did not want to be someone's guilt. He had watched his own mother become that. He had sworn, in that pharmacy bathroom, that his child would never be that either. So he had built a life, quietly, without asking anyone for anything, and it had worked. For 4 years, it had worked. The complication arrived on a Friday, and its name was Rio. The company held a quarterly family event, one of those well-intentioned corporate afternoons with activities for children and catered food and executives circulating with loosened ties. Jihan had coordinated it. He had planned to drop Rio off with his neighbor, Mrs. Yoon, as he always did for evening work events. Mrs. Yoon's hip had other ideas. She called it 4 o'clock. Apologetic, genuinely sorry. Her daughter was coming but couldn't arrive until 7. Jihan stood in the break room doing the math. The event started at 5. His role was non-optional. He had organized it. There was no one else to call on 45 minutes' notice. He picked up Rio from school himself, crouched down in front of him in the school courtyard and said, "You're coming to work with me for a little while. There will be food and other children. I need you to stay where I can see you." Rio looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "Will there be juice boxes?" "Probably." "Okay." He picked up his backpack with the efficiency of someone who had already assessed the situation and found it acceptable. Jihan loved this child more than anything on earth. He also occasionally found him slightly terrifying. The event was already underway when they arrived. The main hall had been arranged with long tables and a play area sectioned off near the windows. Jihan settled Rio at the edge of the children's zone with a juice box, confirmed visually that there were 2 other children approximately his age present, and turned to handle the first of approximately 7 things that needed his attention. He was 40 minutes into those 7 things when he noticed where Rio had migrated. His son was standing near the window at the far end of the hall, talking to Kim Do-hyun, not near him, not in his general vicinity. Talking to him, engaged, gesturing slightly with the juice box, saying something that made Do-hyun tilt his head and respond. Jihan's feet stopped working. He watched. He couldn't not watch. Do-hyun was crouched down, actually crouched, suit and all, bringing himself to Rio's eye level, listening to whatever Rio was saying with complete attention. No performance of patience. Just actual attention. The kind that cost something to give. Rio said something. Do-hyun laughed. A real one, surprised out of him. Jihan had not seen that laugh in 4 years. He made himself move. He crossed the room steadily without urgency, with the face he wore when he needed his face to be a wall. "Rio." His voice came out level. "Good. Come away from there, you're disturbing." "He's not disturbing me." Do-hyun looked up, and for the first time in 3 weeks of careful management, their eyes met. Held. Something moved across Do-hyun's face. Not recognition, not yet. Something else. A small confusion, like a word he knew but couldn't place. "Your son?" Do-hyun asked. "Yes." One word. Jihan reached for Rio's shoulder. "I'm sorry if he..." He was telling me about a book. Do-hyun stood slowly, eyes still on Jihan, still with that expression. About birds. He knows a lot about birds. He does. Jihan looked at Ryo. What do we say? Ryo looked at Do-hyun with complete seriousness. Thank you for listening. Most adults don't actually listen. They just wait. Do-hyun blinked. Jihan steered his son gently away before anything else could happen, his hand at Ryo's back, walking with the calm efficiency of a man who was absolutely not unraveling. Behind him, he felt it. A gaze that stayed too long. A wait that followed. He had made a mistake. Not a large one. Not yet. But Do-hyun had looked at him. Really looked. And somewhere behind those steady alpha eyes, something had snagged on something it couldn't name. Jihan walked faster. The following Monday, Do-hyun requested Jihan by name for the departmental transition briefings. Not his department head, not a senior coordinator. Jihan, specifically by name, with a note attached that said preferred point of contact for operational logistics. His department head delivered this information with the pleased expression of someone who had just received reflected credit. Director Kim was impressed by the orientation materials. Good work, Jihan-si. Jihan said, Thank you. He said it with the right amount of modest professionalism. He went back to his desk and sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then he opened his calendar and began the work of making himself as efficient and invisible as possible in every meeting that now had Kim Do-hyun's name attached to it. It was a narrow path. He understood that. Being too avoidant would draw attention. A coordinator who dodged the executive he'd been assigned to was a coordinator whose behavior became a question. Being too present risked exactly what he was trying to prevent. So he calibrated. He arrived prepared. He answered what was asked. He offered nothing extra. He was, in every measurable sense, excellent at his job and impossible to remember as a person. The problem was that Do-hyun had started remembering him as a person. It began small. A question after a meeting ended. Not about logistics, about something Jihan had said during the briefing. A glance across the conference table that lasted half a beat longer than professional attention required. Once, in the elevator, Do-hyun had arrived just as the doors were closing and Jihan had been forced to share 14 floors of silence with him, and for 11 of those floors he had felt the precise, targeted weight of being studied. You're very good at your job, Do-hyun said. On floor 12. Thank you, Director Kim. That's not what I meant. A pause. You anticipate things. Before they're asked. Jihan looked at the floor numbers. Efficiency is part of the role. It's more than that. The doors opened. Jihan stepped out first. He did not look back. He knew what it was. He understood it better than Do-hyun did, because he understood what was happening underneath the professionalism and the polished confusion. Do-hyun's instincts were snagging on something real, not a memory. The suppressants had handled the scent thoroughly enough that Do-hyun wasn't catching recognition through biology. It was something else. The way Jihan moved, the particular rhythm of how he anticipated needs and managed spaces. They had lived inside each other's habits for 2 years. The body remembered what the mind had been given no reason to retrieve. Do-hyun was following a thread he didn't know existed, and Jihan could not cut it without making the cutting visible. It was Ryo who complicated everything, as it always was, as it could only ever be. The second time they met was not Jihan's failure of management. It was the universe making a point. He had stayed late. A document error that required in-person correction before end of day. Ryo was in the after-school program until 6, which gave him a 40-minute window. At 5:43, the after-school coordinator called. Early closure. A pipe situation. Could someone collect Ryo by 5:50? He arrived at school in 11 minutes. Which was not humanly possible on public transit and which he accomplished anyway through decisions he did not think too carefully about. Ryo was waiting at the gate with his backpack and his dignity intact, entirely unsurprised by any of it. The problem was the document. The document still needed correcting. And the office, at 6:15 on a Monday, was not yet empty. He settled Ryo in the small waiting area outside his department with the book about birds and strict instructions, and went to handle the correction. It took 22 minutes. When he came back, The waiting area was empty. He found them in the break room. Rio was sitting on the counter which they would discuss, eating a biscuit from the emergency tin that lived in the upper cabinet, the one Jihan had always assumed no one else knew about. Do-hyun was standing across from him with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, holding a cup of coffee, listening. And then the lesser spotted woodpecker, Rio was saying, is different from the great spotted woodpecker because of the size. But people always get them mixed up because they don't look carefully enough. Most people don't look carefully enough at most things, Do-hyun said. Rio considered this. That's true. Appa says the same thing. Something happened to Do-hyun's expression. Slight. Careful. Your Appa sounds like someone worth listening to. He is. Rio took another biscuit with the calm certainty of someone who had assessed the situation and found it permitted. He knows a lot. He just doesn't say it in places where people won't use it right. Do-hyun was quiet for a moment. Then, how do you know when someone will use it right? Rio looked at him with those dark, measuring eyes. The eyes that had come from somewhere. The eyes that Jihan had looked at every day for 6 years and understood exactly where they came from. You check how they listen, Rio said simply. When you're talking, do they look at you or do they look past you? You check that. Do-hyun looked at Rio, directly, fully, without looking past him. And how am I doing? Rio tilted his head. You're okay, he said with the particular generosity of a 6-year-old granting a real compliment. Jihan stepped into the room. Do-hyun looked up. That expression again, the one that wasn't recognition but wasn't not recognition. Something between a question and an answer that hadn't fully formed yet. I'm sorry, Jihan said. He kept his voice easy. Parental. Rio, down from the counter. We've talked about this. We've talked about it at home, Rio said, sliding down with cooperation that was slightly too technical. This is a different counter. The rule applies to all counters. That seems inefficient. Do-hyun made a sound that was almost a laugh. He turned it into clearing his throat poorly. Jihan reached for Rio's backpack without looking at Do-hyun directly. Thank you for keeping an eye on him. He was fine. A beat. He's a remarkable kid. Said the way people said things they meant more than the words carried. Jihan felt it land in the center of his chest. He kept his face where it was. He is. Rio, say good night. Good night, Rio said to Do-hyun with complete seriousness. Then he looked at the biscuit tin, then back at Do-hyun. The tin is in the upper left cabinet. In case you need it, I'll remember that. Most people forget, Rio said, as if this were a fact about the world and not a small gift being given, and let Jihan take his hand and walk him to the elevator. In the elevator going down, Rio was quiet for 2 floors. Then, I like him. He's my director. That's not what I said. Rio looked straight ahead, very much his father's son. I said I like him. Jihan looked at the floor numbers. He listens right, Rio said. Like you do. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. Jihan walked out into the evening air and told himself that what was happening in his chest was manageable, that he had been managing for 4 years, that this was not different. The problem was that it was different, because Do-hyun had started coming in slightly earlier on the days Jihan was scheduled for morning coordination, because twice now he had brought coffee to the briefing room and set 1 cup at Jihan's place without being asked. Black, no sugar. The exact way Jihan took it, which he had never mentioned to anyone at this company. Because in the meeting that morning, when another director had spoken over Jihan mid-sentence, Do-hyun had said, quietly and without raising his voice, "Let him finish." And the room had let him finish. None of it was dramatic. None of it was the kind of thing Jihan could point to and call a problem. It was smaller than that. More dangerous than that. It was Do-hyun paying attention. And Do-hyun, when he paid attention to something, did not stop. Jihan had known that about him. He had always known that. He pulled his coat tighter against the evening air and walked his son to the bus stop, and somewhere in the clean cold of the night he allowed himself exactly 1 moment of honesty. He was not going to be able to hold this line forever. He had known that from the moment he saw the name on the folder. He just needed it to hold a little longer. The coffee was not a coincidence. Jihan had known that for 2 weeks and had been treating it like one anyway, because the alternative required decisions he wasn't ready to make. But on a Thursday morning, Do-Yoon set the cup down at his place and then sat, not at the head of the table where directors sat, but one seat closer than necessary, and said without preamble, "Have we met before?" The room had 2 other people in it, both looking at their laptops, neither paying attention. Jihan opened his folder. "I coordinated your orientation briefing, Director Kim, 3 weeks ago. Before that, one beat. One beat was all he allowed himself. Not that I'm aware of." Do-Yoon looked at him. Not the way he looked at documents or problems or the room in general, the way he looked at things he had decided to understand. "I keep thinking I'm missing something," he said. Not accusatory, honest, in the way that was somehow worse. "Something I should already know." "Perhaps you're thinking of someone else." "I've considered that." He picked up his own coffee. "I don't think that's it." The other 2 people began to arrive. The meeting folded around them, and Jihan was grateful, professionally, efficiently, completely, for every agenda item that followed. He answered questions. He presented figures. He made himself useful and unremarkable and entirely focused on the task at hand. He did not look at the one seat closer than necessary. That evening he was late again, a pattern he was going to have to address, because patterns were how things unraveled. Rio was with Mrs. Yoon, whose hip had recovered, and Jihan was standing in the corridor outside his department finishing a call when Do-Hyun came around the corner and stopped. They were the only 2 people in that part of the floor. "Still here," Do-Hyun said. "Not a question." Finishing up. Jihan held the phone down, neutral, calm. "Director Kim." Do-Hyun leaned against the wall opposite him. It was the most informal Jihan had seen him at the office, jacket on but loosened, the careful composure of the boardroom room slightly reduced, the way people looked when the building had emptied out and they'd stopped performing for an audience. This, Jihan remembered. The after-hours version of him. The one that emerged when Do-Hyun stopped being a director or a son or an heir to anything and was just a man in a quiet room. "You never eat lunch," Do-Hyun said. Jihan blinked. "I eat at my desk." "You work at your desk during lunch, that's different." He had been watching, of course he had been watching. "I have a son. The morning is complicated. I use the midday to... I catch up." Do-Hyun nodded slowly. "The boy with the birds. Rio." The name landed in the space between them. Do-Hyun repeated it quietly, like he was trying the weight of it. "How old?" Jihan considered not answering. Considered what not answering would cost him versus what answering would. 6. Do-Hyun was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his expression. Not the executive's composure, but something underneath it. Something that looked almost like calculation except softer. Like a man doing math he hadn't intended to start. "His father," Do-Hyun said carefully, "isn't in the picture." "No, I'm sorry." "Don't be." Jihan said it without edge, but clearly. It was a choice. Mine. "We're not missing anything." Do-Hyun looked at him for a long moment and then, unexpectedly, the kind of unexpected that meant genuine, he said, "He doesn't seem like a child who's missing anything. He seems like a child who has exactly what he needs." Jihan did not know what to do with that sentence. He filed it somewhere he wouldn't look at. "Thank you. Good night, Director Kim." He walked to the elevator. He did not run. He pressed the button and watched the numbers and thought about nothing, which was the thing he had gotten very good at when the alternative was thinking about everything. It was Rio who ended it. Not deliberately. Rio was 6. He was not capable of the deliberate cruelty of adults. What he was capable of was the specific brutality of a child who asks exactly what he means because he hasn't yet learned that some questions are not asked out loud. It was a Saturday. Jihan had made the error, the real error, the one he would trace back to afterward, of letting Rio come to the quarterly park cleanup that Hanul Group sponsored. It was a community event. visible goodwill. His department was required to attend, and Rio had wanted to come, and Mrs. Yoon was visiting her daughter, and Jihan had calculated that Do-hyun would be present for 30 minutes at most, a brief director's appearance, a handshake or two, a departure. Do-hyun stayed for 2.5 hours. It should have been fine. The park was large. The event had 80 people. The probability of sustained proximity was low, except that Rio had found the pond. And the pond had ducks. And the ducks had apparently produced a duckling with a slightly irregular wing, which Rio had been crouching beside for 20 minutes with the focused intensity of a small naturalist when Do-hyun came to stand beside him. Jihan saw it from across the lawn. He was mid-conversation with a colleague. He excused himself. He began to walk. Not fast enough. He was 15 meters away when he heard Rio's voice rise slightly, not in distress, in the particular clarity of a child making a point, and saw Do-hyun crouch down beside him the way he had at the company event, bringing himself level, listening. 10 meters, Rio said something. Do-hyun's expression changed. 5 meters. Rio looked up at Do-hyun with the calm, direct attention of someone who had been thinking about something for a long time and had simply decided, now, to ask it. "You look like me," Rio said. The world stopped doing whatever it had been doing. Do-hyun went very still, not frozen. Still. The way things went still when they were paying total attention. He looked at Rio. Really looked. The way he looked at things he had decided to understand. And this time, Jihan watched the understanding actually arrive. Watched it move through Do-hyun's face like weather. Confusion first, then something sharper, then something that had no name Jihan could put on it from 15 meters away. "Do I?" Do-hyun said. His voice was very quiet. "Around the eyes," Rio said with the specificity of someone who had been comparing. "And here." He touched the bridge of his own nose. Matter of fact, no agenda, just observation, offered honestly, the way Rio offered everything. Jihan arrived. He put his hand on Rio's shoulder. His own hand felt like it belonged to someone else. Do-hyun looked up, and this time there was no half-recognition, no thread being followed. The look on his face was the look of a man who had just understood something enormous and was standing very still inside it, because moving in any direction felt dangerous. His eyes moved from Rio to Jihan, slowly, all the way. "Seo Jihan," he said. Not a question, not an accusation, just the name. Said like a door opening into a room he hadn't known was there. Jihan's hand stayed on Rio's shoulder. His face stayed where it was. He had 1 second, less than 1 second, to decide what the next moment would be. And then Rio, because he was 6 years old and had been carrying a question for most of his conscious life and had just spotted an answer, looked up at Do-hyun with complete, guileless logic and said, "Are you our father?" No tears, no drama. Just the question, clean and precise and devastating, the way only a child could ask a thing that 2 adults had been not saying for months. "Because," Rio continued in the silence, "if you are our father," he paused, considered, "then why didn't you find us?" The duck with the irregular wing paddled quietly at the edge of the pond. Somewhere on the other side of the park, 80 people continued their Saturday in complete ignorance. Jihan could not breathe. He was breathing. He just couldn't feel it. Do-hyun was looking at him. Not at Rio anymore, at Jihan, with an expression that was not anger, not yet, not here, not in front of a child, but was the thing that existed just before anger when the thing you were feeling was too large for any single word. "Rio," Jihan said. His voice came out steady, came out. He was grateful for that, the way you were grateful for small structural holds when everything else was moving. "Can you go find the event coordinator? The woman with the green hat? I need you to ask her for the bird information pamphlet. They have them near the main tent." Rio looked at him, then at Do-hyun, then back. He was 6. He was also, in some deep cellular way, his father's son, which meant he understood when a conversation needed the room cleared even if he couldn't name why. "Okay," he said. He stood up, brushed off his knees and walked toward the main tent with the quiet dignity of someone granting a concession. They waited until he was far enough away. Then Do-yoon said very quietly, "How long?" Not a question, a measurement being taken. Jihan met his eyes. He had run from this for 4 years. He had built an entire life around not being in this exact moment. He was in it now, and there was nowhere left to go. And some part of him, some exhausted, load-bearing part, felt the strange lightness of a thing finally put down. 6 years, he said. He's 6. Do-yoon closed his eyes. 1 breath. 2. When he opened them, what was there was not what Jihan had feared. It was worse, in its way. It was a man who had just understood the full shape of what he'd lost without knowing it was being lost. "You knew," Do-yoon said. "At the orientation, you knew who I was." "Yes. And you..." He stopped. Something in his jaw tightened. "You looked at me and decided I wouldn't know." Jihan held that. He didn't deflect it. "Yes." The wind moved across the park, across the pond. The duck turned in a small, unhurried circle. Do-hyun looked away, then back. His voice, when it came, was controlled in the way of a man using control as structure because without it, something large would move. "I sat with him. I brought him biscuits. I crouched down in a park and let him tell me I look like him and I..." He stopped again. "I didn't know. You made sure I didn't know." "Yes," Jihan said, for the 3rd time. Because it was the truth, and the truth was the only thing he had left to give. They did not have the conversation at the park. Do-hyun was, whatever he was in those minutes, contained enough to understand that. He looked at Jihan once more, something enormous and unresolved moving behind his eyes, and then he looked toward the main tent where Rio had gone. And then he said, "Not here." Quiet. Final. And walked away. Jihan watched him go. He kept his face neutral until Do-hyun was out of sight, and then he sat down on the bench nearest the pond because his legs had made a decision he hadn't approved. Rio came back 12 minutes later with the bird pamphlet and a serious expression. He sat beside Jihan. He looked at the duck. He did not ask where the tall man had gone. After a moment he said, "Did you tell him?" Jihan looked at his son. "You already knew." Rio turned the pamphlet over in his hands. "I look like him around the eyes," he said simply. "I've always known I look like someone. I just didn't know who." 6 years old. 6 years old and carrying that quietly, alone, without making it anyone's problem. Jihan put his arm around his son and held him, there on the bench by the pond, while the park event continued around them and the duck with the irregular wing moved in its patient circles. Rio leaned in without ceremony, let himself be held. "Is he a good person?" Rio asked. Jihan thought about the coffee placed at his seat. The "let him finish" spoken into a boardroom. The way Do-hyun had crouched down beside a 6-year-old and listened like it was the most important thing in the room. "Yes," he said. "He's a good person." Rio nodded, satisfied. "Okay." He opened the pamphlet. "This has information about Coots. I don't really need information about Coots, but it has a good picture." Jihan laughed. It came out rougher than he expected. He pressed his face briefly into his son's hair and then straightened up and looked at the pond and let the afternoon continue. Do-hyun called at 9 that evening. Jihan had known he would. He answered on the second ring. "I need to understand," Do-hyun said without greeting. "I need you to tell me why." Jihan was standing at the kitchen window. The apartment was quiet. Rio was asleep. The 7-minute window stretched out into something longer by necessity. He'd been standing here for an hour already, waiting for this. "Your family had already chosen someone for you," he said. "You told me in March. You said it wasn't finalized. You said you were still deciding." Silence. "I knew what deciding meant," Jihan continued. "I knew what I was in that equation. I left before you had to figure out how to be kind about it. I would have..." Do-hyun stopped. Started again. "If you had told me. If you had told me you were..." "I know what you would have done." Jihan's voice stayed even. This was the part that mattered. He had rehearsed it. Not for this call specifically, but in the 4 years of private arguments he'd had with versions of Do-hyun that didn't exist. You would have done the right thing. You would have come back. You would have set aside the family arrangement and come back because you are the kind of man who does the right thing when the right thing is in front of him. Then why? Because I didn't want to be the right thing. The words landed harder than he intended. He let them. I didn't want you to choose us because there was a child and an obligation and an alpha's instinct pulling you towards something you were supposed to protect. I had watched my mother be someone's obligation her entire life. I knew what that looked like from the inside. I would not let my son grow up being someone's duty. The silence on the other end was different now, heavier. You decided that for me, Do-hyun said, quietly. You decided what I would feel and why I would feel it, and then you disappeared. Yes, that wasn't your decision to make. No, Jihan said. It wasn't. He didn't qualify it, didn't explain it further. It was true, and he had known it was true, and he had made it anyway because the alternative had felt unsurvivable at the time. I know that. Another silence. Longer. I sat with him, Do-hyun said. The anger in his voice had shifted. Not gone, but changed shape. The way things changed when the sharpest edge found the softest place. I bought him biscuits from a tin I didn't know I remembered. I crouched in a park and listened to him talk about ducks and His voice stopped, steadied. I felt something. I didn't know what it was. I thought I was losing my mind. Jihan closed his eyes. That was my son, Do-hyun said. That whole time, that was my son, and you stood there and watched and said nothing. Yes, Jihan, just the name. Raw in a way Do-hyun's voice rarely was. I missed 6 years. The words hit the center of his chest and stayed there. He had known this was the thing. He had always known this was the thing underneath all the other things. Not the deception, not the choices made in a pharmacy bathroom, not the 4 years of careful management. This, 6 years of a boy learning to walk and talk and assess strangers by how they listened. 6 years of books about birds and serious questions about counter rules. 6 years of a father who looked like him around the eyes, crouching down in the world, not knowing. I know, Jihan said. His voice was not entirely steady for the first time. I know. Do-hyun came to the apartment on Sunday. Jihan had asked Rio first, sat him down at the kitchen table on Saturday evening, and explained, as clearly and simply as he could, that the man from the park was going to visit. That he was, in fact, his father. That Rio did not have to feel any particular way about that. That whatever he felt was right. Rio had listened with his full, careful attention. When Jihan finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does he know about the woodpeckers? The lesser spotted and the great spotted? You can tell him yourself." Rio considered this with the gravity of someone allocating a significant resource. "Okay," he said, "but I'm going to check first if he actually wants to know or if he's just being polite. There's a difference." "There is," Jihan agreed. "How do I check?" "Ask him something specific. If he answers specifically, he wants to know. If he answers generally, he's being polite." Rio filed this away. "That's a good system." He went back to his book. Jihan sat at the table for a moment longer, looking at his son, feeling something that did not have a clean name. Not relief, not dread, not hope exactly, but all three woven into something that sat heavy and necessary in his chest. Do-hyun arrived at 10 in the morning, which was when Jihan had said, and he arrived exactly then, not early. He had thought about what arriving early would communicate and decided against it. Jihan recognized that, the consideration that went into small decisions, the way Do-hyun was always 3 steps ahead of himself without showing it. He brought nothing. No gifts, no gestures. He stood in the doorway in a plain jacket with his hands in his pockets and looked at Jihan with the expression of a man who had spent the night doing an accounting he hadn't wanted to do. Jihan stepped back. Let him in. Rio was at the kitchen table with his book. He looked up when Do-hyun entered, assessed him, then looked back down. Do-hyun stood in the small kitchen of the small apartment and looked at the evidence of 6 years. The drawings tacked to the refrigerator, the row of bird books on the low shelf, the careful arrangement of a life built with attention and without help. And something in his face did something Jihan had not seen before. Something that was not composure or control or the executive's considered expression. It was grief. Quiet, genuine, and not performed for anyone. Rio looked up again. "Do you know the difference," he said, "between the lesser spotted woodpecker and the great spotted woodpecker?" Do-hyun looked at him. "The size," he said, "and the markings on the head. The lesser spotted has streaked underparts. The great spotted has a bold red patch." Rio stared at him. "My grandmother had a garden," Do-hyun said carefully. "I used to watch them from the window." The stare continued for another moment. Then Rio closed his book, which was, in his personal taxonomy, the highest possible signal of attention being granted. "Sit down," Rio said. "I have more to tell you." Do-hyun sat down, and Jihan stood at the kitchen counter and watched his son lean forward over the table and begin, with complete seriousness, to explain the migratory patterns of a bird he had been studying for 3 weeks, and watched Do-hyun lean in to meet him. Not performing interest, not being polite, actually there, actually listening, and felt something shift in the center of him, not fixed, not resolved, not simple, but shifted. The way things shifted when something that had been held rigid for too long was finally allowed to move. Rio decided after 1 hour and 40 minutes of conversation that Do-hyun was acceptable. He communicated this not with words but by bringing his second favorite book from the shelf, the one about raptors, which he did not lend, only shared, and setting it on the table between them. Then he looked at Do-hyun and said, "You can look, but don't bend the pages." "I won't," Do-hyun said. "Appa bends pages by accident. He doesn't mean to." "I'll be careful." Rio nodded, satisfied, and went to get a glass of water with the ease of someone who had rendered a verdict, and moved on. Do-hyun watched him go. Then he looked at Jihan, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the silence was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was something. "He's extraordinary," Do-hyun said. "I know. You did that." "Not accusation, not absolution either. Just fact, stated plainly." "Yes." Jihan leaned against the counter. "I did that." Do-hyun looked down at the raptor book. He touched the cover carefully, the way he'd promised. "I'm still angry," he said. "I need you to know that I'm not. I haven't resolved it overnight. What you did was—" He paused, chose the word deliberately. "It was a decision made about my life without my knowledge. I don't know yet how to hold that. I'm not asking you to have resolved it. I know." He looked up. "I just needed to say it. Because the other thing I feel, sitting here, watching him, being in this room, is so large that I was afraid the anger would disappear inside it. And that wouldn't be honest." Jihan looked at him. At the man who had walked back into his life and undone 4 years of careful management just by existing, just by crouching down beside a pond and listening to a child who assessed strangers by how they listened. At the man who was sitting at his kitchen table holding both anger and wonder at the same time because he was honest enough not to choose between them. "I know why I did what I did," Jihan said. "I've had 4 years to know it. I'm not going to ask you to understand it yet. Tell me anyway." Not a demand. A request. Jihan was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was 26. I was alone in a city I had moved to for you. I had no family, no bond, no claim on anything. I found out I was pregnant 3 days after you told me your family had arranged your future." He said it evenly, without drama, because the facts were dramatic enough without help. "I knew that if I told you, you would have come back. I knew that. And I knew. I had watched you for 2 years. I knew exactly how your mind worked. That you would have come back out of responsibility, out of an alpha's need to claim what was his. And somewhere inside that, there would have been love probably, but I would never have known which part was which. I would have spent my life wondering why." Do-hyun was very still. "I needed to know," Jihan said. That if someone was beside me, it was because they wanted to be beside me, not because there was a biological pull or a child or a family obligation that traded one arrangement for another. He stopped. Something in his chest pulled tight. I had already been an Omega in a world that decided things about me. I wasn't going to let my child's life be decided that way too. Silence. Then Do-hyun said quietly, "And now." Jihan looked at him. "What?" "Now." He gestured slightly, at the apartment, at the Raptor book, at the sound of Rio running water in the other room. "We're here. I'm here. Not because of biology, not because of obligation. I'm here because for 3 weeks I couldn't stop thinking about a man I was supposed to have forgotten, and I couldn't stop feeling like I was missing something I didn't have a name for. And then a 6-year-old told me I looked like him around the eyes, and something in me." He stopped, started again. "Something in me that has been missing for 6 years came back." The water turned off. Rio's footsteps moved back toward the kitchen. Do-hyun held Jihan's gaze. "I'm not asking you to trust that immediately. I know what I would have done 6 years ago, and you were right that I wouldn't have known myself which part was which. I don't know that I would have been capable of knowing." Something in his jaw tightened, the way it did when he was holding something difficult without putting it down. "But I am not 28 anymore. And I am telling you with full knowledge of everything, sitting in your kitchen on a Sunday morning. I want to be here. Not because I have to, because being anywhere else right now would be wrong." Rio came back. He looked between them with the particular attention of a child who had absorbed more than he was meant to and was pretending he hadn't. He climbed back into his chair, pulled the Raptor book toward himself, and said, "There's a page about the Eurasian sparrowhawk. It's very good." He pushed it slightly in Do-hyun's direction, an offering. Do-hyun looked down at the page. Then he looked at Rio. Something moved across his face, careful, enormous, and very gentle. "Tell me about it," he said. They did not become something simple. That was not how it worked, and they were both too honest to pretend otherwise. What they became, in the weeks that followed, was something that had no clean name but had recognizable shape. Do-hyun came on Sundays, then on Wednesday evenings because Rio had mentioned that Wednesday was when the nature documentary series aired, and Do-hyun had a television that was larger than Jihan's, and a building with a guest policy that accommodated small, serious children who asked whether the documentary was scientifically accurate. It was not romantic. Not yet. It was something prior to that. A careful reconstruction, conducted honestly, the way you rebuilt something you valued too much to rush. There were hard conversations, more than one. The kind that happened after Rio was asleep and the apartment was quiet and two people sat across from each other with everything that had happened between them still present in the room. Do-hyun said one evening, "I should have fought harder. 6 years ago, when I told you about my family's arrangement, I said it like it was already decided. I handed it to you as a fact. I did that because I was afraid of what it would mean to fight, and I called that fear being realistic." He looked at his hands. "That's not something I can fix retroactively, but I want to name it, because the version of the story where I was helpless isn't true, and you deserve to know I know that." Jihan had sat with that for a long time. Then, "I disappeared without giving you the choice. That's also not a version where you were helpless. And you deserve to know I know that too." They were quiet after that. Not the quiet of resolution. The quiet of two people who had looked at each other's failures with clear eyes and decided deliberately that this was still worth the work. The moment that changed the shape of things was small. It was always the small ones. It was a Thursday evening. Do-hyun had not been expected, and not a Sunday, not a Wednesday, but Rio had a fever, low-grade and manageable, and Jihan had mentioned it in a brief functional message about rescheduling a work document handoff. He had not asked for anything. He had stated a fact. Do-hyun arrived at 7 with medicine that matched Rio's exact weight and age, a container of soup from the place 3 streets over that Jihan had mentioned once, 6 weeks ago, in a conversation about neighborhood logistics, and a book about owls that Rio did not yet own. He stood in the doorway. "You didn't ask," he said before Jihan could speak. I know, I'm not trying to override anything. I just wanted to be here. Jihan looked at him. At the soup, at the medicine, at the owl book tucked under his arm. Come in, he said. They sat with Rio while he drowsed against the pillow, the fever manageable, the owl book propped open on the blanket where he could see it when he woke. Do-hyun stayed. Not taking up space, just present, the way he was learning to be present in a life he had arrived at late, carefully, without assuming he had the right to fill it. At some point, late, after Rio's breathing had deepened into real sleep, Jihan made tea and they sat at the small kitchen table and said very little. Do-hyun's hand was on the table, not reaching, just there. Jihan looked at it. He thought about the pharmacy bathroom and the 4 years and the suppressant at 6:47 and every decision that had led to this table, this kitchen, this quiet evening with a sleeping child in the next room. He thought about the question Rio had asked at the pond. Why didn't you find us? The guileless devastation of it. He thought about the fact that Do-hyun had been finding them in every small way since the first day in the orientation room, without knowing, without being told, pulled by something he couldn't name towards something that had always been his. Jihan put his hand over Do-hyun's, not a declaration, not a resolution, just a hand, placed over another hand, in a quiet kitchen on a Thursday night. Do-hyun turned his hand over, his fingers closed around Jihan's carefully, not grip, not possession, a hold that asked permission and waited to feel it given. Jihan let him hold on. Outside, the city did what cities did at this hour, indifferent and continuous. Inside, a child with a low fever slept with an owl book on his blanket. Inside, 2 men sat at a small table in a small kitchen and held on to each other in the particular dark of a life that had finally, after everything, stopped having to be survived alone. It was not perfect. Do-hyun's anger had not fully resolved and might not for a long time. Jihan's walls had not come down completely and might never, entirely. There were years of absence to account for, a child who deserved more time than either of them had already used, and a future that was going to require more honesty than either of them had practiced with another person. But Rio would wake in the morning to find his father asleep in the kitchen chair, having stayed because it had not occurred to him to leave. And when Rio assessed this with his serious dark eyes, the eyes that looked like someone, that had always looked like someone, he would simply climb into Jihan's lap, look at Do-hyun and say, "You stayed." And Do-hyun would open his eyes and say, "Yes." And Rio would consider this for a moment with the gravity of someone rendering a final verdict. "Okay," he would say, and reach for the owl book, and that would be that. If this story stayed with you, if you felt that moment at the pond or the kitchen table or a small hand reaching for a book, you know where to find more. Subscribe, and we'll keep telling stories worth feeling, not perfect, not peaceful, but real. And this time, neither of them was facing it alone.